All Hallows Eve, a Christian holiday with some practices that go back much further, to a time when we don't have written records, only the symbols of ritual we must now interpret. There's a theory that Halloween is descended from the Gaelic festival of Samhain, the marking of the end of the harvest season and the beginning of the year's darker, colder half. It's traditionally thought of as the day when the boundaries between the living and the dead are the thinnest. Spirits from the other world may need appeasing, or else they may cross over into the realm of the living and bring mischief with them. Music began as analogue, the plucking of a string made from catgut, horsehair. Like souls reaching through the barriers into our world, the barrier between analog music and electric music began growing thinner. A mad scientist named Thaddeus Cahill patented the very first electronic organ in 1897, a tremendous contraption called the telharmonium, which generated sounds through electrical signals. A variety of takes on the electric organ were created in the early 1900s, most of them prohibitively large or expensive. In 1928, Leon Theremin patented the theremin. This instrument uses two antennas as proximity sensors, and the thereminist plays the instrument without ever even touching it, merely by moving their hands in the region near these antennas to create a strange, otherworldly sound. In the 50s, this sound was often associated with the unknown of space. In fact, 7 years before NASA sent the sound of the Beatles across the universe into space, the sound of the theremin was broadcast into the great beyond from a station in Crimea. Known as the first theremin concert for extraterrestrials, the strange music of the theremin is the first music that humans ever sent into space. But let's jump ahead to 1973 in Germany. A band called Tangerine Dream were in the studio working on their fifth album, Phaedra, using a modular Moog synthesizer for the first time. The Moog was designed to be a more practical way of creating electronic music in a smaller and more portable form. The band had struggled for the first couple weeks of recording. For one, this new modular synth would gradually become detuned while it was operating, so constant tuning was needed if they wanted to get a consistent sound. They had problems with their tape machine breaking down. Their speakers became damaged because of the unnaturally low frequency sounds of the bass. While two of Tangerine Dream's 3 members were resting, Edgar Froese was still hard at work. His wife, Monique, was a visual artist who had created, and would go on to create, many of the iconic Tangerine Dream album covers. While he was playing a double-keyboarded mellotron, she was turning the knobs on a phasing device. This moment of the two working together was the final breakthrough they needed in the album's recording. A little more than 4 weeks later, the band had finished creating their 5th album, which, despite being a strange, proto-ambient work, with unusual instrumentation, very long tracks, and a very experimental nature, reached number 15 on the UK albums chart, and 13 in Australia. The strange, alien sounds created by Tangerine Dream caught the imaginations of many. And while not the first time the electronics entered the music charts, it was a rare moment when the avant-garde, using strange and cutting-edge technology, can be said to have broken out of the art world and into the mainstream. This legendary German band, over the course of their career, created over 100 works, counting albums and soundtrack work, and there are few soundtracks for reflecting upon the unknown better than Tangerine Dream's Phaedra. Brian Eno's original conception of ambient music was this: ambient music must be able to accommodate many levels of listening attention, without enforcing one in particular. It must be as ignorable as it is interesting. And in my experience, it's music that can go from background to foreground, depending on where your attention chooses to drift, but it never demands anything of you. You may even forget it's on occasionally. And while we're talking about Eno, how about Ambient 4 on Land? The 4th volume of his Ambient series embraces a darkness that wasn't accentuated in the same way on the previous volumes, making it perhaps the first intentional dark ambient recording. This list is not strictly focused on ambient music. When I say Halloween ambient, I'm talking about music that's largely instrumental, but will help to create a Halloween vibe. I suppose you could call it more of a Halloween ambiance. And before we move on from monumental works in experimental and dark ambient music, we should talk about Aphex Twin. Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. While Volume 1 is talked about more broadly and more reverentially, it would absolutely be a mistake to leave this classic in the background. The second volume of his Selected Ambient Works is more, well, actually ambient. It's dark, minimal, a slowly moving and expansive beast. The whole project stretches out over 156 minutes, none of the tracks titled. Selected Ambient Works 2 excels in a way that is distinct from any other project in Richard D. James's iconic body of work, by being the only one that feels like genuine ambient music, haunted and well composed and simple, without ever forcing itself into the foreground. And it's an ideal soundtrack for spooky autumn nights. On Halloween, children walk the streets in disguises, asking for treats at the door. This tradition shares a lot of symbolism with the Samhain tradition of mumming. Mummers would dress in disguises, walking door to door, perhaps singing or performing a poem in return for food. And these disguises were often dressing up as the spirits that were so close on this night. This was possibly linked to an older belief that by masquerading as one of the spirits out roaming on this night, you were safe from the real spirits who were out creating mischief. These mummers were often led by a white mare, a figure draped in a white sheet, with the skull of a horse extended high atop a pole, bobbing through the mist as the figures approach. The symbolism and origin of this tradition are not fully clear, although it exists in various forms in Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales, with different names. Some historians say it's reckless to speculate, but who cares what they think anyway? Other historians say the white mare was a pagan symbol of death that survived long after most of the rituals surrounding it had faded. Disguised as figures of death, and often donning white and black face paint, the musicians of the early Norwegian black metal scene could be said to also masquerade as the dead. With morbid imagery and a habit for some fairly serious mischief, many of these bands are now legendary within metal, including the band Emperor. I'm not really here to talk about Emperor, though, not as a whole. I'm here to talk about Mortiis. He played bass in Emperor for a couple of their earlier years, but then he departed to work on his own material. And his material in this era was different. It was instrumental, composed entirely on synthesizer, and was described by Mortiis himself as dark dungeon music. It shared similarities with some previous New Age and neoclassical music. This sound wasn't exactly new to black metal either. Black metal artists including Burzum had used synth passages within black metal, providing moments of reprieve from the blast beats and shrieked vocals in other louder and faster passages. But Mortiis focused on going deeper in this direction, with whole albums composed in the style, like the album that translates to Born to Rule. Mortiis wasn't the only one from the Norwegian metal scene who began exploring this dark dungeon sound either, and it became a curious offshoot of the black metal scene in the early 90s. And yes, fact checkers, I'm aware I'm abbreviating and simplifying this history, and not talking about fantasy synth, minimal synth, new age music, or early influences from the 70s and 80s, but chill out, I'm trying to tell a story. These Scandinavian bands created these synth recordings, spreading them on cassette in the same way many of the early black metal albums were circulated. Cassettes were cheaper to reproduce than other options, and the fact that cassettes were more difficult to copy than CDs had the benefit of keeping things a little more underground as well. Now fast forward to the 2010s, and this early dungeon music had become dungeon synth, a typically fantasy-themed and lo-fi synth-based music style. It's been compared to video game music, and this certainly could be an influence on some musicians within the scene. Although, as we've seen, there are some bloody black roots down below this seemingly sweet and innocent branch of music. And the branching continues, with offshoots like comfy synth, a style of dungeon synth focused on calming and nostalgic aesthetics, cosmic synth, winter synth, forest synth, mushroom synth, No, I'm not kidding. A whole microgenre of artists exploring mushroom-themed synth music. Which brings me to the real place this whole rabbit hole has been going: pumpkin synth. A style of dungeon synth and dark ambient music that weaves in elements of Halloween specifically. Whether these are spooky sound effects, samples from horror movies, or just a more eerie sound palette, this is a microgenre of dark ambient synth music that, strangely enough, grew out of the brutal Scandinavian black metal scene. You have Pumpkin Witch, perhaps the originators of pumpkin synth, who make genuinely noisy synth music. This is not comfy synth, my friends, and not always ambient either, with some high-pitched and piercing sounds that, in my mind, are meant to capture the feeling of the Pumpkin Witch herself, as her gaze lands upon you and begins to painfully tear away at your mind. If you prefer your mind as it is, their most recent release, Return of the Pumpkin Witch, is an easier listen, and has more similarities with more conventional styles of synth music. I would also recommend Woodland Spell's Key 18 Harvest Tales. Haunting, drifting synths float over a bed of tape hiss that makes it feel like you're listening to something old and forgotten that was left at the back of an attic for decades. For a pumpkin synth adventure that's less lo-fi, Guild of Lore's Autumn Macabre has a more varied sound palette, with cleaner production. Synths that are reminiscent of some real instruments, like dulcimers. Guild of Lore are fairly prolific, and aren't always pumpkin synth, but this one certainly fits the Halloween mood. The mummers of the past have become the trick-or-treaters of the present. Now, children roam the street in herds, as many stay inside, waiting for these trick-or-treaters, giving out candy and perhaps a few scares. For this tradition to be reenacted, there have to be those waiting at home to give out the treats after all. And what better way to spend the time between groups of trick-or-treaters than by curling up on the couch in front of a scary movie, subliminally reminding you of how thin that line between life and death truly is. Conveniently, scary movies have provided some of the best music to accompany Halloween. There are few songs more synonymous with Halloween than the Halloween theme song for the movie Halloween. And I don't mean this Halloween, or this Halloween, I mean this one. But the slasher soundtrack I can't get enough of is actually Halloween 3, the often maligned movie in the series that doesn't include Michael Myers at all. John Carpenter wanted to make the series more of an anthology, centered around Halloween itself, not Michael Myers. But then people hated this first attempt at that format, so I'm getting off topic. This soundtrack is underrated, just like the film, and I recommend both for your enjoyment as you wait for trick-or-treaters this year. Or maybe Suspiria. This soundtrack by Italian progressive rock band Goblin merges some unusual instrumentation with creepy vocals and memorable synth melodies to create one of the most beloved horror soundtracks of all time. And their other soundtracks to the films of Dario Argento are also worth exploring. And you can't talk about eerie soundtracks without mentioning Angelo Badalamenti. If this were a ranked list, and not whatever this is I'm doing, the soundtrack to Twin Peaks would be at the top. This soundtrack captures the strangeness of the show, with elements that are lovely and harmonious, but some things that are just slightly off, creating an uncanny valley effect, where it feels like there's a world of darkness lurking just behind the thin veneer of normalcy around you. Everything looks peaceful, but it feels like there's something dark and twisted, just beyond the line of trees in the distance. The present-day mummers make their way to the door. They knock, and as the door opens, they say, "Trick or treat." The word treat still holds meaning, but what about trick? Well, the mummers of old were known to not only dress as potentially menacing spirits, but behave as them as well, creating mischief if there wasn't a treat to be offered. Children dressing up on All Hallows Eve seem to have begun in the early 1900s, and the earliest known version of this phrase, tricks or treats, can be traced to Canada. My favorite version is treat up or tricks, which I expect was only said by the most evil of Canadian children. Although I probably shouldn't pick on Canadians, since all children are frightening, immoral creatures. As I want no mischief on my doorstep, I'll offer the treat of my top haunted ambient musical selections that could make a good soundtrack to your All Hallows Eve. The Dale Cooper Quintet, Parole de Navarre. This fluctuates from some eerie and funereal jazz to a dark ambient that leaves behind any obvious jazz influence. It sounds like what you might hear coming from a haunted and nearly abandoned jazz club on a rainy night. The Night Monitor, Horror of the Hexam Heads. I could tell you about any of the Night Monitor's work, and it would be a good soundtrack to your Halloween, but this new project from 2024 is particularly eerie. It could be the soundtrack to a creepy video game or an 80s film, but it's not, so make it the soundtrack to your next midnight ritual. Ulver, Scary Muzak. Here's another of the Scandinavian black metal bands from the 90s, but this one has been consistently shape-shifting for decades since then. And in 2021, they released their own take on Halloween synth. For a band of this talent level to do straight-up hokey Halloween music, it feels a little bit like you're watching Steven Spielberg direct a school play, but I do enjoy what they came up with. Earth, Hex, or Printing in the Infernal Method. Do you like your spooky soundtracks with a hint of the Wild West? Then this is for you. Earth is an influential and important drone metal band from Olympia, Washington, but they have quite a few albums that remind me of the deserts of the Southwest United States. This album won't give you much of an autumnal vibe, but it has a whole lot of ominous darkness to offer. And before we move on from drone metal, how about Sun's Black One? Unlike that Earth album, this one does lean more into the metal potential of dark ambient, with faster metal riffs sometimes in the background, adding another layer to the dark texture, along with creepy monster voices that are far enough back in the mix to allow them to still be part of the ambiance, but still bringing to mind the feeling of black metal despite the glacial pace of the songs. Tim Hecker, Virgins. This is an ambient musician you should absolutely explore if you haven't before. This album certainly isn't as minimal as a lot of what you'll find on this list, but it has a very high creepy factor. This isn't music for the slightly eerie moments. This is music for when you're finally entering the really scary room full of all the, I don't know, evil dolls or something. And finally, one of my favorites for this time of year, and also probably the most obscure, Corveria, Psychoanalysis. This was an obscure album of Italian library music. In other words, music commissioned by a company, who would then sell the rights to this music, avoiding the difficulty of paying the musician each time it was licensed. 2 albums were released under the Corveria moniker, but the names for library musicians were often pseudonyms, so we really don't know anything about who composed this wonderfully dark ambient album from 1977. Thankfully, the music has been rediscovered, and can even be heard and purchased on Bandcamp now. So there you are, from Brian Eno and Tangerine Dream, to dungeon synth and drone metal, to current masters like Tim Hecker. That should be enough creepy ambient music to soundtrack these days, when the dead are just a little bit closer to the living than we might like them to be. I hope you enjoyed this little experiment, and found some of the music interesting enough to check out. Subscribe if you want to see more music-related content. And in my next video, I'll finally stop talking about Halloween. I promise. This has been Eclecticism. Thanks for watching.